Very nice signs. Thank you. In order, traditionally, I would just speak from the heart for the entire speech. But given the fact that we have translation, I will try to stay on script. However, I feel so energized being in this room. I hope you'll forgive me if occasionally I try to add a little bit more. First of all, thank you so much, Mr. Park and Ms. Park, for your wonderful invitation. It's truly an honor to be with everyone here today. And I think a moment like today can't come at a better time because it's such a unique moment for all of us. I really want to discuss a few different things, but let me also just start by saying that in events like this that allow every single person in this room to become individual ambassadors for our countries, for our beliefs. And only in countries such as yours and in mine can that happen. And so thank you for doing that, and thank you for being here today. There's just three key observations I'd like to truly talk about today, and then we'll have a lot of time for question and answer where we can discuss anything you'd like. And I'm happy to take any and all questions. I don't promise to always give you any and all answers, but I will take any questions. I would like to first say that we live in remarkable times in our countries. We have a great opportunity, the United States, the Republic of Korea, and all of our mutual allies. There's never been a moment in history of mankind when we have the type of technology that we have, which has improved the lives of so many people. They've lifted millions out of poverty and put the power of communication in the hands of everyday people. We see that here today with the number of YouTubers who have so many influential channels, both of their own right and on Twitter and on social media. It's an amazing thing what technology has allowed. But there's also a downside to some of that technology. Automated innovation, artificial intelligence. These technological advancements, which provide such great opportunities to so many, also have left many others in our nations in the core manufacturing base feel left behind. There's a lot of workers who've been told that since the moment of birth, if they just show up, worked hard, played by the rules, their company would take care of them. They would be there with a pension or with a retirement savings. Yet, because of the modern technology and changes, many are on the receiving end of what we in the United States call a pink slip, a slip saying that they're out of work. It takes away the dignity and the pride of that job. What you find often is that many assembly lines, especially in the United States and in many developed nations, are shuttered. You find that places that were once thriving, communities that were once thriving, have lost a lot of hope. And so with that in mind, we're going to discuss the issue of international trade and how America's current approach is largely driven by both the economic realities, but also the impact on communities and people, and the political impact of that as well. The second thing I'd like to discuss is that right now there's a global competition between capitalism, as stated and supported by the Republic of Korea and the United States, and those of state-supported economies such as China, with an extension of a divide between liberalization of government, liberal democracies, free speech, freedom of religion, that the Republic of Korea and the United States stands for, versus countries like China. From this, we're going to discuss America's efforts to ensure that nations are driven by self-determination and rule, democratic principles, and open, free market economy. And this conversation, of course, will be mostly directed in the role that China plays in this competition, both in this region but also globally. And given some personal experiences, we'll especially discuss the role China has played in sub-Saharan Africa. And then the third, and to some degree final part of my formal remarks, we'll discuss our collective security agreements, which have been the bedrock of security in the 20th century and have been challenged by both allies and adversaries alike. Leaders and people are questioning the usefulness of these agreements in the new era. But these conversations are not all negative, they're also positive. They allow us to address and modernize these agreements to approach 21st century challenges from a security perspective. So I'd like to discuss how multilateral efforts have been key towards containing the threat of a nuclear DPRK, as well as how multilateral security agreements such as NATO in Western Europe and Eastern Europe have been improved to address modern-day threats. And so I'd like to paint a little picture about how we are where we are. And I think a really important day of that was the evening of November 6th, 2016. It was on that evening that I was standing on the 5th floor, and then later a lot of us moved up to the 14th floor of Trump Tower in Manhattan, New York City. It was right on 5th Avenue in Manhattan, and we were just feet away from where the studios were, where then Donald Trump had the top running show in the United States for years called The Apprentice. It was the #1 show for many years and it taped right there. It also served as the campaign headquarters for his presidential election. And yet, instead of determining that night which entrepreneur Donald Trump was going to hire, America made its determination that they were going to hire Donald Trump, which is good for all of us. So this comes from a number of factors. How did we get there on that night in 2016? You know, yes, his name identification was sky high. His name emblazoned on the side of buildings on skylines across the world, including here in Seoul and in Manhattan. He had the #1 TV shows I mentioned for 10 years running. And he had a tie collection, a clothing line that I'm sure made its way into boardrooms all across the world, including here in Seoul. But as much as his celebrity status and his business status made him such an important character and gave an ability for him to win that election, it was something more than that. It was the issues he talked about. He went out across the country and spoke about the forgotten man and the forgotten woman of America. He was often talking about how trade deals have left so many American workers, the people who work with their hands, have been left behind. So let me talk a little bit about background on that. Donald Trump's public policy agenda has been focused on international trade for decades now, well into his time as a private citizen. Since the 1980s, President Trump consistently questioned the usefulness of international trade if agreements were not in place that ensured adequate and access and fair treatment for American businesses. For decades, President Trump directed these opinions towards the Japanese-American trade relationship. There's many interviews from the late 1980s where President Trump, then Mr. Donald J. Trump, had spoken about how Japanese-American trade relations were not fair for American workers. But more recently, President Trump has focused that attention towards the U.S. trade relationship with China. As underpinning, the President's opinion of this stems from the belief that trade deficits have long been ignored by politicians of both political parties. They've been ignored by the elites of many nations at the expense of the working class people. And so they've done that in name of free trade. Well, President Trump's estimation of free trade only matters if it's fair trade, trade that's equitable and fair for both countries, as well as for the workers of those countries. We need to ensure that a fair trade agreement ensures an open market for American businesses, expanded purchases of American goods. And just this month, President Trump reiterated this view. He was at a campaign rally in North Carolina, and he said that for decades, America's trade relationship had left us with closed factories, no jobs, no nothing. And this you can find the political context for his views towards trade as well. After all, he made these comments at a campaign rally for his re-election. But while from the 1990s through 2014, public opinion supported free trade, by the time that the election in 2016 had rolled around and was in full swing, public opinion was much more likely to believe that free trade policies and multilateral agreements were not helping the American worker. They hurt the American economy due to its impact on America's manufacturing base. Economists frequently discount the impact of these trade deficits among countries. They argue that ultimately is a result of the needs for goods being traded to the benefit of both sides. But President Trump and several of his advisors, including the Director of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, believe that this theory discounts the manufacturing workers in the country that produce the goods, that make the goods, and that it benefits purely the consumers. Ultimately, this is the underlying argument between free trade and fair trade. Are you more concerned with reduced prices for consumers because of increased global competition of goods, as well as reduced labor costs? Or are you more concerned with the economic well-being of the manufacturing worker? the people of our own countries that actually make the goods. Their livelihood depends upon increased sale of American goods at a good price, both at home and abroad. Now, underscoring this point remains the political dynamics of the United States. I'll provide a little more political background because I'm not sure how familiar everyone here is with how American electoral politics comes about. You know, in the United States, unlike most countries, you don't have a single popular vote. You have the founders of our country, the drafters of the United States Constitution, institute a system called the Electoral College. This makes an American presidential campaign not just one national election, but 50 individual state elections. Each state casts its vote, designated electoral votes in favor of a winner of the pluralities of that state. So in states where I've come from, like New Hampshire, if the plurality of voters vote for a candidate, that candidate gets New Hampshire's electoral votes. The electoral votes are determined by population size. You look at a state like California, where I'm sure many people in this audience know have a lot of friends and family. They have 55 electoral votes, made up of 53 members of Congress and 2 members of the United States Senate. And that's how they get the combination of 55 electoral votes, but they're determined by the plurality of the votes. A state like Delaware, on the other hand, has 3 electoral votes and represents its 1 member of Congress and 2 United States senators. And you might say, why did the founders of America decide to design this? Well, they did it to ensure that everyone had a voice. That wasn't just those who lived in the urban areas to determine the outcome of a presidential election, but a president had to go into these states and talk about issues that affect everyday people who often feel left behind. They have to go to the farmers in these communities. They have to go to the manufacturers in these communities and have a real conversation, try to earn their vote just as much as the vote of a coastal elite. So ultimately, the winner of a presidential election must receive 270 electoral votes. That's a majority of the electoral votes that are cast. Now, because of political partisanship in the United States between Republicans and Democrats, the 2 major parties in the United States, you have strong Republicans and strong Democratic states. So states like New York and California are considered very likely to support a Democratic candidate. States such as Alabama and Texas are likely to support Republican candidates. While this shifts each election cycle a bit due to the changing public attitudes and population movement, the underpinning of the electoral map usually remains somewhat similar. But in 2016, the Republican Party was facing a challenge, a predicament. Several states that long helped the Republican Party succeed in electoral college had shifted towards the Democratic Party over the past 15 years or so. States like Virginia have become very Democratic, whereas just about 15 years ago, they were very Republican. So in order to be successful in the Electoral College, Republicans would need to win states that long have been considered battlegrounds, ones where presidential candidates year after year always compete, states like Florida, North Carolina, Ohio. But they also had to find new ground for the Republican Party's message. So Donald Trump and the Republican Party targeted states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Maine, states that had not voted for Republicans since 1988, or in the case of Wisconsin, since 1984. So in a generation, essentially, they voted for Democratic candidates for president. But while these states have become a bedrock of the Democratic Party, the population was largely exurban. There are folks who live in suburbs and farming communities. There are individuals who work in the manufacturing economy. They're the ones who build American automobiles. They're the ones who use American steel. They're the ones who farm consistently. And these are the states which have been the hardest hit by modern technology and globalization. Many workers who have for generations been told that if they followed the family footsteps, that if they found a good job working on the floor of an auto manufacturer or steel company, they would be taken care of by their company. They'd get good health benefits. They would secure a work position and a pension. Often these would be partially funded by the company and their accompanying union. But with the advancement of free trade agenda that began in the 1980s and continued under both Republicans and Democratic presidents alike, these manufacturing jobs began to be outsourced to places such as Mexico, China, India, and parts of Southeast Asia. Workers in America's Midwest, often called in America the heartland, were being told that the covenant between them, the agreement between them and their employer, the same one that was passed on generation and generation, was no longer true. This led many workers in the states I just mentioned earlier feeling disillusioned by their politicians, betrayed by their politicians, forgotten by the elites, that would make them disaffected from the political process. Many had given up hope that a political leader would come along and speak to them in their problems, their concerns, given that the leaders of both parties, Republican and Democrat, often ignored them for decades. But by speaking directly to the manufacturing economy, by speaking directly to these people without the prism of the mainstream media, but directly to the people, making a centerpiece of his campaign the trade negotiations to both renegotiate trade deals such as NAFTA, the Korean-US-American trade deal, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and negotiate new trade deals, Donald Trump gave hope to these voters. In many cases, voters who had not participated in the electoral process for decades showed up and voted with enthusiasm since they finally had a candidate for president speaking for them, and I had the chance to meet many of these voters personally. On the president's campaign, I worked with many states, nearly every state, but I was particularly focused on states like Michigan, states like New Hampshire and Maine. It was towards the end of the election when we sensed an opportunity to secure Mr. Trump's victory in these locations. Voters who had been laid off for years, whose former employer no longer had a manufacturing plant with even a 5-hour plane ride to them, would come up to me and say that they had never heard a political candidate in their lifetime look out for them. These were auto workers in Detroit, Michigan, and pulp workers in Berlin, New Hampshire, who had finally felt like someone might finally be willing to break conventional wisdom and say that yes, America still could be a leader for manufacturing. Yes, they could bring factories that have been shuttered for decades back. Yes, there could be good paying jobs that gave them the dignity of work, that allowed them to provide food and housing and education for themselves and also their families. And that while some of this is anecdotal, the statistics make this impact clear as well. If you go back to 1990 in the state of Michigan I just talked about, they had over 800,000 manufacturing jobs. In 2016, that was decreased to 600,000 manufacturing jobs. So on election night, like I mentioned earlier, Mr. Trump was waiting in a room full of campaign staff and a few outside supporters. We were all standing there with our eyes glued towards the televisions. I was in between that room and a room with some smaller staff where we were trying to calculate all the election results coming in from key swing states like Florida and North Carolina, the ones that were earlier in the night because polls closed earlier. We had these enlarged electronic maps on the wall. We could tabulate the electoral votes in each key battleground state at the most local level. But while Florida had been focused on early on, our attention then turned to the Midwest, the heartland, as I was saying. And we had hoped and eventually would expect that one by one, as the states came in, showing that the voters I just talked about, the ones who use their hands to create the goods we all use, as we say they are in the United States, they're the ones who shower after work, not before work, because they have the dirt on their hands. Those people had come out in force in support of the election of Donald J. Trump to be President of the United States. So we can all talk about it. I will tell you also that these states remain just as important for next year's election in 2020. Without the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, it will be much more difficult to win that electoral college I was discussing. That is why you've seen President Trump continue to move forward on his trade agenda, working with allies and competitors alike to renegotiate trade deals that can benefit the heartland, the men and women who work in the manufacturing base of the United States. So what does this mean with regards to the context of the current trade environment? Well, it means three things. First, President Trump is actively looking to expand into markets which American companies can sell goods to. While I will address America's viewpoint towards Africa later, that becomes fertile ground for new trade opportunities, as well as much of Asia. Second, it means looking at the rules for each trade agreement to determine whether it establishes fair, equitable, and reciprocal playing field for both partners. As such, you continue to see the United States draw a hard line on issues such as open market access, forced technology transfers, and intellectual property rights in nations such as China, which do not respect or recognize any of those. Third, and perhaps most importantly, President Trump is looking at foreign markets to purchase more American goods.
Just these past 2 weeks, President Trump delayed the implementation of additional tariffs on Chinese goods, in part because their celebration, but also because of their need for additional pork and agreement to purchase more American soybeans and other products. But this is temporary. We need to ensure that there is widespread access for American goods throughout the globe for all of our trading agreements. By the way, the same way every other country, including Korea, is looking out for their farmers, for their manufacturers. You know, I'm going to go off script briefly, but President Trump just the other day, in his address to the United Nations General Assembly, said that it's sovereignty, sovereign nations that will lead the way forward, not globalization. That's in the interest of our leaders to look out for its people. And that while we can work together, no one's going to look out for another country's best interests at heart like the leadership of their own country. And that's what we need to respect, sovereignty. So while President Trump draws a hard line to help American workers, he understands that other countries will draw that hard line for their people too. I'll say, you know, clearly Donald Trump has not forgotten the American workers because you see that in trade discussions. Updating and modernizing trade agreements. You know, just near America, that means renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now in the form of the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, it contains many facets of the original agreement, but it also provides expanded sales opportunity for American dairy producers, pharmaceutical companies, also expanding the overall percentage required for manufacturing of auto parts made in the larger, greater North American continent. Most pressing, though, in developing is the cementing of a framework for trade allies in Asia and Europe, among America's largest trading partners. Such action has been taken regarding improvement of trade relations with the United States and Korea. After the 2012 Korean-US agreement went into effect, the United States trade deficit increased by 75%. In order to improve this, Donald Trump made renegotiating that agreement a cornerstone of his trade policy. In 2018, the United States and Republic of Korea signed agreements to improve the trade agreement, and these measures include exporting more US-made automobiles to Korea by doubling the number to 50,000 of cars permitted to be manufactured in the United States and traded into Korea, and then improving customs processes, and also address pharmaceutical pricing. These are efforts that will result in more reciprocal trade relationship that will ultimately help both countries. Now, regarding the ongoing trade negotiations with China, as you know, China has now been believed, I'll say believed, we all know this though, to manipulate its currency with opaque procedures that benefits its industries. The government of China is strongly believed to back its private industries that include technology giants such as Huawei, that are often used as state-sponsored spying activities. Now, in fact, just several weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that several countries in Africa were working with Huawei to spy on its own citizens. That's commercialized spying at this point on behalf of the Chinese. You add in that the market in China is inhospitable to foreign investment, a lack of respect for intellectual property rights, and forced technology transfers. And you have a combination of a centralized, state-sponsored economy that is not competing on the same playing field as true free market economies such as Korea and the United States. While both Republicans and Democrats have run administrations in America which for decades have allowed China to get away with these unfair trade practices, I would call it highway robbery, putting a sense of harmony of both the benefits of America's workers and, candidly, the workers of so many. Donald Trump is determined to make tough decisions to ensure that China becomes a good faith actor in the international marketplace. The Chinese have been wagering, betting, for quite some time that they could present a deal that is nothing more than what I would call window dressing, something that gave false hope, something that allows for a press release to give to the New York Times, but it would gauze over the underlying issues of their closed market system. But while both sides would like to make a deal, I'll remind them that Donald Trump will not accept a fake deal. He will not accept a deal which does not look out for the interests of America and its allies around the world. President Trump has now stated unequivocal terms and followed through on this directive when he rejected a vapid offer earlier this year. China is also believed to be undervaluing the political hand the president plays. I believe, and others do, that China feels they can hold out on making true market reforms in their hopes that will bring volatility to the American markets, become a political challenge for President Trump in the 2020 election. However, they're discounting a real fundamental core fact, that most Americans are in firm belief that the efforts undertaken by President Trump are necessary for an equitable, longer-term trade agreement. They also have more faith in their president, Donald Trump, than they do in the Chinese government. You add into the fact that market investors continue to see opportunities in American markets. And while it's been a bit of a roller coaster this past year, no doubt, the Dow Jones and NASDAQ continue to reach historic heights. Therefore, it is in China's best interest to understand that a false olive branch will not be accepted by the Trump administration. They must move forward with a genuine offer of reform, one that truly opens up the market and levels the playing field. China cannot expect that its economic actions will get a pass as they steal American, European, Korean, and Japanese intellectual property and technology while they use massive arm and bank accounts of their government to prop up businesses in the international marketplace. If China wants to be accepted into the true international economy, then it's time for them to act as a true market-oriented economy, where goods and ideas succeed. Americans want to get a deal done with China, but only if it delivers real change, not false hope. With that, I'd like to turn to my second point from earlier, which is that separation between state-sponsored economies that also happen to have a limited respect for human rights and democratic processes. Ones that nations such as the United States, Korea, Japan, Europe, and much of South America and Africa share. While our leaders are more connected than ever, they're frequently in communication by the day. We as an international community have allowed large-scale actors, most notably China and Russia, to masquerade as good faith players in the international community. I was with President Trump as he announced the national security strategy for the United States. They announced in 2018. And it was the first time in American history that national security strategy actually recognized the global competition that exists between the United States and China. Much like the Soviet Union in advance of the Cold War, China has relied upon a small cadre of an elite to rule their country. They offer small pieces of economic advancement for return for complete and total autocracy among an oligarch. We need not look further than the ongoing protests in Hong Kong to see how the failed Chinese philosophy that says, give us your freedom and we'll give you economic security, do not match the hopes and dreams of their own people. And so we wish those protesters luck as they stand for their rights of freedom of speech and democracy. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't. Richard Nixon in 1972 visited China for the first time. First time an American president did that. America sought to open the door for unprecedented success for the people of China. The theory at the time was that if somehow we could bring elements of a free market economy into China, that maybe ultimately democratic principles would follow. Some politicians went to say that if only we can sell McDonald's cheeseburgers in China, pretty soon they'll have a right to vote. But it was a good faith effort by the United States that had America encourage China's acceptance of the World Trade Organization in 2001. Again, believing that giving a seat to China at the table of open economies would encourage a responsive and appropriate behavior. Well, a generation later, and that goal is unfulfilled. The desire of America and the American people remains for the Chinese people to have both an open economy and a political system designed to allow representative democracy, free speech, free press, freedom of religion, and ultimately respect for the will of the people, not the powerful. You'll note that I used the word freedom quite a bit there.
Yes, yes.
That's because ultimately that's the underpinning of America's desires, and I believe the desires of everyone in this room for all people around the globe. Freedom. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to act like America or mimic everything that we do, but it's for each people to have the freedom to determine their own destiny. That's what we're seeking. The government of China is currently on a dangerous path, one that restricts free speech of its own people. In fact, China has now built an aggressive surveillance state. They're backing private companies such as Huawei, like I mentioned, help monitor the movement and speech of their own citizens. It's embodied the Chinese to develop a social credit score, where they get to determine who has value. It's not up to God and it's not up to others, it's up to the government, is what they say. The Chinese government has also cracked down on religious freedom. They've imprisoned approximately 1 million Muslims and held them in camps for indeterminate periods of time. The Chinese ruling class has cracked down on Tibetan monks who continue to light themselves on fire as an expression of protest, believing that if they are going to have their rights as a human being taken away, then they themselves will take away their own life instead, because that's more important. The Chinese government doesn't even allow for the Catholic Church to determine who its own bishops will be, deciding that they, the government, had a better idea than any one person's faith. However, the true challenge lies not just in China's abject rejection of consideration of the free will of its own people. They're now determined more than ever, expanding their conquest for influence around the world. This has been done in part through the One Belt, One Road initiative. They've offered predatory loans to developing countries, with payment terms often unable to be met. Once the terms cannot be paid back, Chinese companies, with the backing of their government and its capital, places to take ownership of those entities in these nations. Everything from electric grids to mining. Even worse, these projects are not even completed with local labor. It's frequently reported that Chinese government and companies ship in prisoners from China to help build the infrastructure in these developing countries. When the project is finished, they rarely bring these prisoners home. They often leave them in their new country. This is a form of modern-day colonialism, and that's not my words, that's the words of leadership among leaders in Africa and what they've explained to me. Modern-day colonialism. They lure countries in the need of too good to be true loans that cannot be repaid. They then take over sectors of the economy of these nations. They ship their own prisoners into colonies. I saw some of these efforts firsthand during my time at the State Department. I traveled hundreds of thousands of miles in that role and saw firsthand the impact of China's efforts, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. One doesn't need to go far beyond the airport. In particular, I remember getting off the plane in Lusaka, Zambia. After entering into that hot and humid weather and getting off the plane on the tarmac, I looked up and on the billboard it said, "The Bank of China welcomes you to Zambia." Some welcoming committee.
Oh my God.
This example also played out much closer to you here in Sri Lanka. Just not very far away in Sri Lanka, Chinese state companies helped build a port, again with predatory loans and terms that could not likely result in repayment. When Sri Lanka could not make the required payments, China forced their hand and took over the port, which they then subsequently established into a military base for China's Navy. Even completed work is questionable at best. I don't forget there's a notable moment in advance of Kenya's elections in 2018. Just weeks before the election, the incumbent president, President Kenyatta, stood in front of a bridge built by a Chinese company, ribbon cutting. It wasn't any more than 2 weeks after that bridge was built and declared open for use with the ribbon cutting and all, that it collapsed.
Oh my.
That's some metaphor for working with the Chinese.
That's true.
Now I want to compare those efforts to that of the United States. You know, there's a lot of noise around about where the United States stands in the global economy, where it stands right now as a leader in the free world. But you know, just this past year, the United States alone spent over $50 billion providing assistance to many of these same countries. These investments have, we can applaud that, that's good. By the way, the American people are happy to do it. They're happy to do it. They're happy to be generous people. Now, these investments have led to many things. They've led to expansion of health services and treatment for deadly diseases, assistance with election procedures for the purposes of a fair electoral process, and also helping ensure young people, who are making up an expanding share of the population in many developing countries, receive adequate education that prepares them for the modern economy. America doesn't ask anything in return for these efforts, other than the basic idea that these governments should be responsive to the needs of their own people, And that starts with a strong democratic process. America has also now passed the BUILD Act. It transitions what we call the Overseas Private Investment Corporation into a new Development Finance Corporation. It has an expanded mandate and a portfolio to allow it to support private businesses through increased lending capacity, equity investments, and offers of political risk insurance. Rest assured, these loans are offered on a market and developmental basis, unlike the Chinese loans. These ones are meant to give developing countries an alternative to the predatory lending practices of Chinese investors who are backed by their own government. And that's the competition of today. What will our world's leaders do? Will they stand up for the sovereignty and security of their own people by rejecting the false promise of quick and easy Chinese cash? America's hope is that leaders put the interests of their people first. And let me reiterate, America wants to work with the government and the people of China. It will continue to work with them on issues of regional and global security, including the threat posed by nuclear regimes such as the DPRK. But we expect that China will begin acting like the world leader they seek to be, through respect and the will of its people. The third point I'd like to discuss is the ways to modernize the framework of our collective security agreements among allies for the purposes of confronting rogue state actors and as well as the increased threat of non-state actors. Early in the administration, we saw these efforts all too well. I was in the room with then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson within hours after we learned that the DPRK sent off its first missile over to Japan in the era of the new Trump administration. We also recognized that was an early test for our new administration. How would this new president, President Trump, react with such saber rattling from the part of the Hermit Kingdom? Well, they quickly saw what happened. America mobilized its allies, most notably Korea and Japan, for the purposes of engaging them and containing the threat of the DPRK. America also worked with the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, to impose strong international sanctions that actually included support from China and Russia. These efforts brought to bear the unified front to bring the DPRK to the negotiating table. I'll also note that, I'm going to go a little bit off script again, but this reminds me of another American president, President Reagan, who said peace through strength, which means that our allies must stay unified in its strength in order to bring about peace and not the other way around. Now, obviously, as we all know, these efforts are still underway, and President Trump continues to work with the government of Korea as it needs to. In fact, he was with President Moon just this week where they discussed ongoing discussions with DPRK. And as you know, they actually visited the DMZ. And I give President Moon credit for saying this. He did say, when he talked about the collective security of the people of Korea, he said that the security of the Republic of Korea and U.S. alliance has become a comprehensive strategic alliance that strengthens cooperation in not only security, but also economic, regional, and global issues. Such steadfast Korean-U.S. alliance is working as the linchpin for regional peace, stability, and prosperity, and we have decided to continue in close coordination. While America remains committed to working with its allies to ensure the mutual cooperation on purposes of intelligence and security. President Trump has reiterated his support for the NATO alliance and security agreements, including the U.S.-Korean security agreements. However, many of these agreements were first structured decades ago, when the world and its economies looked drastically different from it does today. While the United States will never shrink from its responsibility to lead, it is not unreasonable to ask developed nations of wealth to begin to chip in for some of the costs associated with that collective security. Yes, that even includes the Republic of Korea. President Trump and America remain committed to the security of the Korean people. Our history is so strong in this regard. And I think we saw it when we said, I have to say I was so touched personally when we had the silent prayer that I think underscored the relationship between Korea and the United States and the shared history that we all have. So thank you for that. But when we're talking about how to pay for it, we have to acknowledge that Korea is not it has a stronger economy today than it did 20, 30 years ago when many of these agreements were discussed, sometimes more. And so when President Trump asks for countries to provide a little bit more economically, monetarily for their own security. We hope that that's met with an understanding that we just need to modernize these agreements. But we still stand committed to working with each other to ensure the security of the Korean people. You know, this ask has been made of many other allies as well. Germany, France, many developed nations of Europe, which have great capacity to contribute more to their own security. And you've seen President Trump ask NATO members to commit their 2% share of GDP on security spending to support the collective defense of Europe. We need this in order to truly tackle and confront the security challenges in each region. So I want to make a brief touch point on the 2020 election as well, because I'm sure everyone here is wondering what is happening in the United States. You know, at the moment, President Trump remains in a strong standing, and there's a large field of candidates in the Democratic Party running right now. They're seeking to be the nominee to face off against the president. And while it was expected that former Vice President Joe Biden would be the presumptive favorite of his party, it's actually now Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, and Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, who have been polling very closely in states that will hold the first primary elections. In fact, just this week, a poll from Iowa and New Hampshire, the two states that vote first in the primary process, have now come up with polls that show Elizabeth Warren leading Joe Biden. By the way, this whole discussion about the elites versus the people happening on both sides of the aisle in America, because both parties feel like the elites have forgotten them, the powerful have forgotten them. And that's why you saw President Trump win, and I think that's why you're seeing so much unease in the Democratic primary right now. Now, as a result of their party's primary, these candidates have been forced to move to the very, very, very liberal side of their party, very far left wing, out of the mainstream of American ideology. They've staked out extreme political positions that are out of step with the average American person. And it's expected that because of this, they will not be able to win next year's election. I also have to note that President Trump's trade policies have become so universally agreed to in key battleground states that the Democratic candidates for president are now agreeing with President Trump.
Right.
So why don't we send a little message to China quickly on that, to let them know that if they were hoping to wait President Trump out in his election, one, he's not going anywhere.
Right.
Two, both sides agree that China has to make changes. So I want to conclude kind of with a brief story. It's one that that I've thought a lot about. I think it symbolizes America's approach and the approach that other countries we've spoken about today do. And I think it sums up the great conflict and battle of ideas that we're having in this geopolitical conversation right now. I was traveling to Johannesburg, South Africa, and I participated in a meeting with many African ministers of health. While I was in the car there, I saw a sign on an empty lot that said, "Paid for by the People's Republic of China." So I asked my driver, I said, "What are the Chinese planning to build there?" He then replied, he says, "I wouldn't know." He said, "They came in with all this money. They bought up the property and put up the sign. But that was 5 years ago." So I found that interesting, because I didn't really think about it too much at the time. It was kind of interesting, but I go to these meetings later with the African ministries of health, and a gentleman from the health ministry of Botswana stands up. And his words have been etched in my memory ever since. He will describe the status of his country and how its people at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the early 2000s. He said those days in Botswana, they had a saying that Saturdays are for funerals, because everyone knew someone at that time who was passing away from HIV/AIDS. It's a terribly sad thing to say. But then he said, because of what the American people have done, because America now still commits over $6 billion a year to confronting and combating HIV/AIDS around the world, most notably in sub-Saharan Africa. He said, this was what really made me stuck with me. He said, because of the American people, Saturdays in Botswana are not now for funerals, but Saturdays are for celebrations. They're for weddings, they're for birthdays, and they're for parties. You know, as an American, made me immensely proud of that moment. Made me remember what the true context was and the difference was between the way America approaches the world and the way places like China does. You know, I think that symbolizes a lot of the difference, right? And for China, it's an empty parking lot. For America, it's saving millions of lives. So with that sentiment, I'd like to conclude my remarks. On one final note, just to remind you that America remains committed to being a leader in this world, but we can't do it alone. We need strong democracies that value the will of its people, that value the freedom of religion, the freedom of press, the idea that capitalism and market economies are the best ways to control ideas and economies. Places like Korea, a strong alliance between Korea and the United States must remain to confront these global challenges. And of course, with the continued leadership of President Donald J. Trump. So thank you very much.
USA! 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 USA!
Thank you so much, man. So just give him a big hand of applause again. So we're gonna have a small break, a little bit of a break time, so you can sit. Yeah. 지금부터 약 10분간 그 휴식 시간을 갖겠습니다. 그리고 휴식 후에는 여러분들 질문지를